Jerry Gidel, back to our program to talk about the market and the coming week with the WASDE report and several other things right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe. So, Jerry, what happened this week? Can you explain that?
Well, some days it's not as easy to explain a market that really was pretty choppy here. We ended up really kind of came in with some of the late negativism of last week ahead of the weekend, and that kind of carried through. Then Tuesday, we had quite a turnaround, a classic scenario there on that market as uh, conditions in South America were, starting to really show the fact that the dryness in Argentina was still there and projected to continue for most of this week and on into next. And then the twist of it, too, of course, was some rains up in Mato Grosso that was slowing things down. So that was part of it. Then Wednesday we shot back and forth. Then Thursday we had, you'd have to say somewhat of a lackluster export sale, actually kind of disappointing in my opinion. But the market had quite a turnaround on that, as the interesting fact was that the Chinese were a purchaser of about 2 or 3 cargoes of new crop soybeans, and also bought some a small amount of old crop corn, and so both of those sparked their interest, and we had quite a rebound yesterday early in the sessions, and then it kind of waned as the day goes on. And then today, here on Friday, we got all fired up as the OPEC ministers decided that they were going to continue their reduced oil output, and that market went excited. The financials went excited, and I think also the fact that next week's weather in South America is not looking all that positive, as we just mentioned earlier. Dryness in Argentina and rains continuing in Mato Grosso.
Yes, and I look at that U.S. weekly export sales, and does something surprise you, or are you okay with those numbers?
Well, the weekly numbers, the week before we had some issues of some of the cold weather and issues that hit the U.S. and that. This last week, I'd have to say, actually, the interesting number in beans, actually, they said there was 12 million of old crop beans, but when you actually compare it to the previous week, it was only 8 million. And the new crop numbers were positive. That's, we talked about it earlier here. From there, but wheat and corn, pretty lackluster there. But the thing about it is, don't forget, in the corn and soybeans here, we're talking about modest levels that we need to export, have export sales on. Right now, we're at 40 million is all we have to do to hit the USDA's uh, current projection for the whole year of 2020-21. Corn, we're at 350, something like that, or more yet to go. But that's percentage wise, the 87, 88% sales level is still far and above the highest percentage of corn sales we had on the books of a USDA projection at this stage of the game. And that all comes because of that big purchase here back in the last week of January, where we jumped it up, 290 million that week. 240 million of that was the Chinese purchases. So it's a kind of interesting fate. Unfortunately, what happens in the world of overseas demand is that we get used to big numbers, and then when the numbers get less, we get disappointed. Well, the problem is we can't have big numbers like we've had oh, geez, some soybeans starting last fall. They now corn just a few weeks ago. Those are not normal numbers. And so you can't get totally, you mentioned before here, we are statistically way ahead of schedule here on our sales for the year. And particularly in South America here on soybeans, the world is looking that direction. They're not going to be looking to the U.S. here. And also locally down there, your currency values are under attack at this point. And so that means that, the dollar, when they're, interestingly enough, the world's South America's real is weaker. That means they can be a lot more competitive in that scenario. And so that's another feature in this thing that makes it, limited report. And how do we see those numbers changing? That's another part of the equation here as to we go forward here in U.S. and world prices.
Yes, and what about the coming week? We have a big WASDE report there. What's your expectation?
Well, I'm kind of like the crowd is here. The nobody's really looking for a lot of big change. Excuse me, March numbers here. Usually February and March are times when the USDA kind of makes their big judgments around the final production number in January, and then they're starting to wait to see what kind of yield results come out of South America. Also, on more information as to what you might adjust, particularly on feed demand for corn. On the soybean side of things, we just recently got a very impressive crush statistic out there. Just, I think it's on January's U.S. soybean crush. I think that's the one area that I think the USDA on soybeans will probably make an adjustment in that. Some people are looking for 10. I'm looking for some room in their imports into the U.S. of potentially raising that number 10 million or so. So in reality, 150 million is my expectation. The people involved in very reluctant to. If you look at the demand numbers on exports, you look at demands on crush. Boy, you could take this number down from 120 to 100 easy enough, maybe even less. That's not their style, so I don't think that's going to happen. They're going to have to really down to it. As big a crop demand as we have, we kind of need 100 million as our minimum out there, and so I don't know that that's going to happen. But the exports for soybeans were actually 10 to 15 million above what the inspections kind of suggested. So that's another feature in this thing that we got all kinds of numbers to look at from the USDA. And I'm looking for unchanged. The trade is looking for about 30 million less at 1.47 billion bushels. I don't have a real problem with that. The biggest problem in this thing right now is that at this point, I realized that it was a freak situation in weather, and also the fact that the Midwest and their natural gas that they had already contracted with their supplier at a very competitive rate, and then turned around and had an opportunity to double or triple the profits they could make on that versus producing, and really didn't need it. So, we had a big drop down to 650,000 barrels a day. We did bounce back this last week up around 850,000 average day, and there's 35 to 940,000 we had 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I think that's one of the features that might be slipping. We might have a little better exports going in. So I think the USDA is just going to punt. It's another one. They have another tradition of not changing their exports and feed usage all that much at this time of year. And the tricky thing of this thing right now is that with the Russian approach to the markets here recently with their increased tariffs, some of these buyers are going to have to switch to the U.S. to make some purchases. That's a possibility, no doubt. But I think the twist of it is hit this thing in the last a couple 3 weeks. Some of our competitiveness at this point, and I think there's been a lot of buyers in the wheat market that have accumulated some pretty good supplies on hand, and I think they're going to be reluctant to, as I said, we might slip a little bit, and that 10 to 20 million. But interestingly enough, all those numbers, wheat, corn, and soybeans here, are not numbers that are significantly different than where we're at, and got revved up again today, and maybe it'll get revved up on some of the weather issues next week. Every day we got to find something that's going to be positive, and that could make things vulnerable after the crop report next week if we don't see something significant adjustments in South American crop sizes.
Yes, I saw that the USDA attaché in Argentina already reduced by 1 million metric ton the Argentina output for soybeans.
And I know you've heard the same situation from the Buenos Aires Exchange is inkling at something even down below 140, below 46. I think that's not. We're really in an important period of time here. the first crop beans have got dinged up a little bit, but the interesting thing right now in Argentina is that the beans that were planted after the wheat, interesting situation. It happens in the U.S. too, where all of a sudden, if you don't get the soybean plant up to a certain height when the heat and dryness is going on, in essence, it shade itself, and the rows and things like that, it becomes quite vulnerable to damage to the plant, and it'll just stop. Soybeans, but if they don't get to that stage where they're able to, I call hunker down. Now that's definitely an old agricultural term in the U.S., but it's a scenario of them being able to get to that state. Corn's a situation too, that some of the pollination situations and filling with the kind of heat and dryness in that down there is it makes things quite interesting at this point on what kind of output that Argent late can we plant corn in Mato Grosso. This week's numbers from the Brazilian, the Mato Grosso economic department up there. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's IMEA. And that the fact that we're still 20 to 25% behind on some of the corn plantings, and unless you get the beans out, and the beans moved up to 60 week, and we're talking about that being against the average we're about 10 to 15% behind, and on last year's numbers we're 20% behind, and so that feature in there is still some numbers next week that maybe are maybe not as snappy as they could be. Maybe this market is really going to have to see how we get this corn crop in the ground in Mato Grosso, and how the weather impacts, see what the March 31st U.S. Planting numbers are going to be. In the past here, we've edged these numbers up potentially from the USDA's Ag Outlook report that was here a couple weeks ago, and that I think that is possible. I think we are running into issues, 2 million number that the Ag department came up with here on corn, and the 90 million number on beans. From there, right now, 2 million acres more into that thing, but how it's going to be mixed up and how it's done. Because really, at this point, we really could use a few more beans being planted in the U.S., particularly if issues in Brazil are starting to slip this 133 number that there's been pretty so much. If it slips it down to 128 because of the weather, that makes things even more important that we get more beans planted in the U.S.
Yeah, I got one question from a viewer named Ethan, and his question is about the soybean corrections. Do you think too high?
Well, I think in general, the markets at this point have made a significant increase. We're up into areas that could end up becoming, has already happened here over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and that we had the big push on corn because of the Chinese purchases up to 575 on the nearby. On the soybeans, there might be some upside, and I think one of the things that might occur here is that we could have a correction of some a little bit bigger magnitude than we've had over the last 2 weeks here, if these numbers on Tuesday don't really don't provide any excitement. I guess the key feature for that to occur would also be the fact that all of a sudden starts putting big rains into the important breadbasket there of Cordoba, Santa Fe, and Buenos Aires. Right now, there's not much for next week. There is some indications, and from weather people I kind of follow, that maybe the week after it could happen. But for the report, if that starts to become a factor, then that might be the correction that could happen in these markets. I don't know, though, that we're going to have a top of the market here. It's a real difficult thing. When you're at these levels, it's always hard to see why it's going to people to be 80, 90% sold in old crop, and only just getting their fingers started in the new crop because of the fact that there's so many uncertainties here in the crop size for the U.S. in the 2021-22 year. I don't think that the new crop prices are going to completely collapse here in the U.S. or around the world, because actually the Chinese and the world really need to encourage the U.S. And other producers out there to don't sense that the crops U.S. and world prices are going to just topple here at this point. But I am not optimistic that we're feeling like we're in a position to have another $1.50. We've got to digest a few things here and see what's happening in South America.
A lot of uncertainty indeed. Thank you, Jerry.
You bet. Well, it's always good to talk. Listen, we'll be looking forward to what happens in the USDA numbers and the weather in your part of the world.